Book Talk. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I'm really glad to be with you tonight and to be with our author, Myra Strober. If you are new to JWA and to our quarantine book talks, thank you for joining us. If you've been with us for months, welcome back. I want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for supporting our online programming and jewishLIVE for their partnership. For those of you who are new to JWA, we are a digital archive that helps expand the Jewish narrative by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We explore the past as a framework for understanding the issues that are important today. And the Quarantine-ish book talks are just one aspect of our work. I hope you will check out jwa.org to explore the many different kinds of projects and resources that we offer. A quick moment of logistics. I hope that you will introduce yourself in the chat box. Make sure that you chat to panelists and attendees so that everybody can see. We love to see where people are joining us from. Please also ask your questions in the chat box throughout our conversation, and I'll be sure to share them for our discussion with Myra. And I am so delighted to introduce Myra Strober tonight. She is a labor economist who is professor emerita at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University and professor of economics at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. She is the co-author of The Road Winds Uphill All the Way, Gender, Work, and Family in the United States and Japan, as well as the author of the memoir, Sharing the Work, What My Family and Career Taught Me About Breaking Through and Holding the Door Open for Others, which we'll be talking about tonight. She was the founding director of Stanford's Center for Research on Women, which is now the Clayman Institute for Gender Research, and president of the International Association for Feminist Economics. She has served as an expert witness in legal cases involving sex discrimination, sexual harassment, the valuation of unpaid caring work, and has consulted with several corporations on improved utilization of women in management and work-family issues. Welcome, Myra.
Thank you.
So glad
to be here.
So glad to have you here tonight. I really enjoyed your book, which just seamlessly weaves your personal story with the larger context of the time and of feminist awakening. And I thought you did such a wonderful job of bringing to life the feminist slogan, "The personal is political," which of course means that the things we often experience as individual challenges are actually determined by the larger systems that we live in. I'm really looking forward to talking to you about your story and also about that larger context, the economics of women's work and more. But I'd love if you could start us off by giving everyone who is with us today a little taste of your story with a quick reading.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start, and in just a few minutes, you will figure out exactly where we are and when. And then I will move on to a second story, which is more personal. It's because you live in Palo Alto, the chairman of Berkeley's economics department tells me. I can't have a regular job here because I live in Palo Alto? He nods. Chairman Brake is tall with football player shoulders. And although I'm tall too, his massive frame towers over me. He's the big shot in one of the most prestigious economics departments in the country. I'm the assistant professor wannabe. If this meeting doesn't go well, he could decide not to hire me for next year. Under my jacket, rivulets of perspiration are making their way down my dress for success blouse. You have to live in Berkeley to be on your tenure track? Again, he nods. I'm baffled. I never knew that. My husband, Sam, is a medical resident at Stanford and works incredibly long hours. Often he goes back to his lab late at night to check on his experiments. We have to live in Palo Alto. Okay, I say softly, getting up to leave. Thanks very much. When I get to my office, my hands are shaking. I can hardly insert my key into the lock. I feel drained, disoriented. Did I take something out of the freezer for tonight's dinner? Lamb chops? Hamburger? I dial home, but Margie, my babysitter, doesn't pick up. She's probably taken the kids out somewhere. I leave my office and walk across Sproul Plaza, surprisingly quiet after all the years of student demonstrations. It's 1970, and the Vietnam War is beginning to wind down. I slide into my full-size blue Chevy with a trunk large enough to hold both a stroller and a carriage and review my meeting with Brake. I spend a lot of time in Big Blue these days. It's about an hour between Palo Alto and Berkeley in the morning and longer in the late afternoon, and I do the commute 3 days a week. Gradually, crawling in stop-and-go traffic toward the Bay Bridge, the absurdity of Brake's answer registers. My first response is to cry. I grope around in my purse, pull out some tissue, and dab at my eyes. But now the road is blurry. I switch my thoughts to my children. Mommy, Mommy, Jason, my 3-year-old, will scream with delight when he hears my key in the door. And Liz, 11 months, will follow his lead. She'll speed across the living room on all fours, tug on my leg, and make joyful noises. Suddenly, the traffic starts to move. I can never tell why the snarls dissolve, but I'm always grateful. As I drive at normal speed, my thoughts turn back to Brake. But this time, instead of tears, I'm aware of growing anger at myself. What's wrong with you? I scream inside my head. You let him intimidate you. You let him make you mute. You're a smart woman, and you let him make you look stupid. Faculty don't have to live in Berkeley to be on the tenure track. He fed you pure bull, and you bought it. You want to know why you can't have a tenure track job at Berkeley? Look at what's real. There are no women, except Margaret, in the whole economics department faculty. And though she's been there for more than 20 years, she's still a lecturer. Wake up. The difference between a lecturer and assistant professor is monumental. Assistant professors have a regular job with opportunity for promotion and lifetime tenure. Lecturers, on the other hand, are on a road to nowhere. They're appointed from year to year, generally only a few months before their teaching is to begin, and have no chance of advancing. I've worked too hard for too many years to be content with second-class citizenship. I intend to get the real deal at Berkeley. When I finally get onto the Bay Bridge, my anger changes. Now I'm furious with Brake. How dare he tell me I have to live in Berkeley? The radio is tuned to a talk station, and I register Joe Carcione, the popular greengrocer, instructing the whole Bay Area about choosing pumpkins. Ah, Halloween is coming. Maybe I could revisit Brake's office in costume. Witch? Skeleton? Big bird? Surely some costume could shake him out of his "we all have to live in Berkeley" routine. With my sheath skirt and matching man-tailored jacket, I'm wearing stockings and high heels. The stockings feel sticky and the shoes pinch every time I accelerate. How I would love to kick off those shoes. Whoever invented high heels definitely didn't have driving in mind. I'm getting angrier by the second. At the traffic, which has snarled again, at my gluey stockings and too tight high heels, and at my own naivete. But most of all, I'm angry at Brake. Slowly, I begin to understand what people mean when they say their anger makes them see red, because a swelling fury, a deep, scarlet anger now floods my car. The steel frame and glass windows can't contain it, and it bursts onto the road like a flaming oil slick, a torrent sliding over the bridge's girders and thundering across the bay. As the lights of San Francisco begin to flicker against the darkening sky, I feel a flicker of light within myself. I become a feminist on the Bay Bridge.
Thank you, Myra. It's a great depiction of a click moment, of a feminist awakening on the road.
Right. Okay, the second one is similar but different. This one involves my grandfather. By the way, 3 of my cousins are on this call tonight, so they remember my grandfather as fondly as I do.
And we have some of your students too who are talking in the chat about how you are a national treasure.
Oh, how nice. Okay, so I am almost 13 years old here. When Hebrew school starts up again for the fall term, my best friend there, Billy Green, tells me he's preparing for his bar mitzvah. Billy is almost exactly my age, so I ask my Hebrew teacher if I can start preparing for my bar mitzvah. Nobody has taught me that girls have a bat mitzvah instead. Certainly not, he says. Bar mitzvahs are for boys. But why? My Hebrew is as good as Billy's. I'll work hard, I promise. My reading will be perfect. It's absolutely not possible. Billy and I are the two top students in our class. He gets to have a bar mitzvah and I don't. That's not fair, I tell my mom. It's not about fairness, Mom says. Women and girls simply can't read Torah or Haftorah from the bima, the raised platform in front of the ark that holds the Torah. Mom says my Hebrew is better than most men's and I understand exactly what the Hebrew says, but I've never read Torah or Haftorah from the bima either. I appeal to Grandpa. Where does it say in the Torah that girls can't have a bar mitzvah? His answer is one of exasperation. The Torah is filled with different commandments for men and women. You're a woman now, enough with the questions. His message is clear. When I was a young girl, he found my questions charming. But now that I'm a young woman, they're unwelcome. I want to remind him that he was the one who told me all people have the same piece of God inside them. That surely my piece of God warrants a bar mitzvah for me as much as Billy's piece warrants one for him. But I know I will be greeted with stony silence. I never stop admiring and loving Grandpa, but after this conversation, our relationship is never the same. No one seems persuaded by my arguments about fairness. In one form or another, they all say the same thing. This is what it is. Accept it. But I'm enraged, and I can't. In 1970, the economist Albert Hirschman wrote that voice and exit are the two productive responses to dissatisfaction, be it the dissatisfaction of a worker, a customer, or a citizen, and that when voice is closed off, exit is the only remaining choice. Workers strike or look for a new job, customers shop elsewhere, and citizens leave their political party or their country. When I am denied a bar or bat mitzvah, I take the only path open to me. I exit. I'm never going to Hebrew school again, I tell Mom. And that's the end of my childhood Hebrew education. It's also the end of my friendship with Billy. I don't even attend his bar mitzvah. Although it was not until my meeting with George Brake in 1970 that I became consciously aware of my feminist leanings, I clearly had feminist inclinations much earlier. But I was a child and a product of the 1940s. I exited from uncomfortable situations when I could, but basically I accepted a gendered reality and did what I was told. However, as my adolescence advanced, so did my rebelliousness. And it keeps going.
And we'll get back to the bat mitzvah piece towards the end. Thank you so much, Myra. I mean, I think, one of the things that I see so clearly in both of those excerpts is all the ways that we internalize things. And sometimes we internalize conflicting things, right? We internalize how things are and that shapes what we even notice. But then we also internalize lessons like some of the early lessons you learned from your grandfather about questioning. And so even when the rules change as we get older, those things are still sparks inside of us. And one of the things that we think about a lot at JWA, a lot of our work is really about expanding the range of role models that people have access to. And one of the things that we often say is that if you can see it, you can be it, meaning that representation matters, that, depending what we see around us will shape our understanding of what is possible. But obviously, there also are people like you who are pioneers, who are able to imagine that they could do something even without having seen other people do it before. So how do you think that it occurred to you that you could do what you did, become an economist and kind of create a new field in that way? What was it like? The secondary piece of that is, what was it like to do that without role models?
So I became an economist with what economists would call imperfect knowledge. I had no idea what the field of economics was about or like. I certainly had no idea that it was so heavily male. Really, it wasn't until I got to my PhD program at MIT, and there were only two other women in my class of 30 PhD students, that I realized that this was, and of course, no female faculty, that I realized that this was a male profession. I became an economist because my father was always in fear of losing his job. And I loved my father dearly. And I think there was a part of me that thought I could help him if I understood how the economy worked. Now, after about 2 weeks of economics, I realized that what I was learning was going to be of help to him. So I had to find other reasons to stay. And of course I did. But I just liked the material. I liked the questions. My sister also became an economist, and we used to ask each other, knowing what we know now, would we do it again? And we agreed that we would, because the questions we still think are such important questions.
And you talk also about, that there were certain things that you weren't able to do, like create a marriage with an equitable division of household labor, in part because you didn't have role models for doing that. So role models still mattered in some ways, I guess.
Well, the fact is that my parents had a reasonably equitable distribution of labor at home. And that's in part because my mother earned more than my father did. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that until I was applying for financial aid in my senior year. And we had to look at everybody's finances. But my father did a tremendous amount around the house. But it never occurred to me to think about that in getting married. And one of the things I'm doing now is writing a book with a former student of mine, Abby Davison, about decision-making for decisions that involve both love and money. And this book is based on the course that I taught for many years called Work and Family. And now we're going to call it Love and Money. And it urges people to think, men and women, to think about these decisions. For instance, getting married. What sort of mate do you want? And what sort of division of labor are you going to have? This was a question that simply never occurred to me when I was looking at getting married. My ex-husband said he would be supportive. He wanted me to get the PhD, but neither of us understood what that was going to mean in our lives if I was going to have an advanced degree. His comment was, well, you can teach in college instead of in high school. And neither of us understood that it wasn't an easy transition from one to the other.
Right. You talk also about how you found sort of mentors or role models in historical figures. Like there's a great scene where you are reading Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the library. What did you learn from those kinds of historical mentors that you found?
Well, reading about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, reading her work and then reading about her was a phenomenal experience. Not quite as phenomenal as eventually having an adult bat mitzvah, but it really was fabulous to discover Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And at the same time, I was very angry that I hadn't discovered her earlier. I loved social studies in high school. Why was the only feminist I knew about concerned with the vote, suffrage? Why didn't we know about Elizabeth Cady Stanton? And, I hope that young people today have more in their social studies classes about feminism than I did. They have to have more. I had none. But she really became alive for me. She was my companion, even though she had been dead all these years and, had such a different background than mine. I snuggled up to her, intellectually speaking. And that was very comforting to me. Particularly her comment that the men have monopolized the occupations, because that's what I saw in my meeting with Brake. By the way, I went back to Brake again, and I called the following day and I said I wanted an appointment with him, and his secretary told me he was very busy. I had to wait 3 weeks to see him. And when I went back, I said I wanted to ask him the same question I had asked him before. And he asked me if I wanted him to be frank, and I said yes. And he said that the reason why I couldn't have a regular appointment was because I had 2 young children. My daughter was, less than a year old, and my son was about 2. And quote unquote, they couldn't figure out what was going to happen to me. And I said, well, I'm not asking you to give me tenure, put me on the tenure track. And in 6 years, we'll all see what happens to me. And he said, I could never sell that to the department. And what happened was that the spring before I came, the women at Berkeley, not just in economics, because they weren't on in economics, but all the women faculty at Berkeley were lecturers, almost all. And they had filed a complaint with the Labor Department. And shortly after I got to Berkeley, investigators from the Labor Department came to look into this complaint. And when I found out about that, I realized that Brake was going to have to sell this to the department, which he eventually did. And I did get an offer from Berkeley. So the second lesson is that not only should you speak up, but people should speak up together. You need allies. You need to have a coordinated fight. And when you increase your power, good things happen.
Yes, with a little persistence thrown in there too. Going back, I think having a little courage and persistence doesn't hurt. But I think you're right. Certainly the collective voice is stronger, and part of what your story is not only your story, but the story of a movement that happened to coincide with your life, and that you could then participate in and be part of. And that was one of the things that also struck me in the book, and was sort of my next question, is about the role of having community. Both, it's very clear in the book, there are several times where you don't have that, and you write, I had no one I could talk to about this. And then when you do have it, it's so important. So I thought a lot about in your book about the role of sisterhood and what sisterhood means and what it makes possible.
Well, I was fortunate to be able to find sisters on the Stanford faculty in other disciplines. And so creating the Center for Research on Women brought those women together. And as more women came onto the faculty, more of them came to the center. And that was very wonderful collective action. But then the other wonderful thing that happened is that I got to Stanford and I had women PhD students who really at the time were only slightly younger than I. And they have, over the years, I love you all, they have been the most wonderful community for me. And then discovering women in economics all over the country and then all over the world. So yes, I was very fortunate to come of age at the same time that the women's movement was beginning. And the second wave of the women's movement.
You write about how your students kind of made you more radical. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What were some of the lessons you learned from your students that shaped your own scholarship and your own outlook?
Well, the very first course I taught at Berkeley on women and work had very few women economists in it, because there were very few women economists. But I remember there was one woman who was a sociologist, Maxine Raz, and she wrote me a letter, slipped it under my office door, and said that what I was teaching was about the situation. I was describing the situation, but I wasn't helping people to understand how to change the situation. And I realized this is absolutely right. Actually, at the time, I don't know how much this is true now, but at the time, this was a big difference between economics and sociology. Economists were busy describing what was, the situation, the economy, and sociologists were much more interested in change. And so that was a real wake-up call for me. And I've not found her again, Maxine Raz, but I'd love to find her again because I'd like to thank her personally for ringing that little alarm bell and saying, it's not just that we want to hear how the situation looks and how it got that way, and we want to know how to change it.
Yeah, I think about this a lot with history too. I think we teach history very poorly in the States. And so people often think that history is just about the past, right? And they often think it's about, the most uninteresting things about the past, the facts, the things that you could look up that you don't need to analyze necessarily. But one of the things that I'm always saying, and I'm a little bit of a, I often joke that I'm raising consciousness around history as much as around feminism in my work. But one of the things I often say is that because history is the study of change over time, if you're interested in change, you have to be interested in history because it gives us the insight into how change happens. It's not only about what has happened in the past, it's about understanding how what has happened and what has changed gives us the tools to think about what change we can make going forward. And it's not often how people look at it.
I have been educated so often by my students and former students. I remember one time a former student, Lisa Petrides, and I were having lunch, and it was after some national furor, and I was talking with her about it, and she said, well, what are you doing about this? And I said, nothing. And she said, yes, you are. And she took out her laptop and she typed what I was saying, and she sent it to me so that I could write a piece about it. I would never have done that, Lisa, without you. So
yeah, that is great. It's great when people can reflect back to us the things that we already know but don't realize that we know, or the things that we're already doing but don't realize that we're doing. And so often I think our students, but also just our friends and our interlocutors can do that so well for us.
Yeah.
And women especially, I think, often do that well for one another. It's one of our superpowers.
My son and daughter are playing that role now too. They often listen to me go on and say, well, what are you doing about it?
All right. So tell us a little bit. I mean, I know some of the people who are with us here tonight, in addition to my dog, who apparently has a lot to say about this subject, are students of yours or know about your work. But for those of us who don't come from that background, tell us a little bit about what feminist economics is.
Well, feminist economics is about change, and feminist economics is asking how gender affects the economy and how the economy affects gender. So it's the causation going both ways. And so feminist economics is in the labor market. We need to look at these issues, but also in the home and other unpaid work. How is unpaid work valued is a feminist economics question. And how is unpaid work valued in the economy? Let me give you an example here. We're all in this awful lockdown as a result of COVID. People are asking about why schools have been closed. And feminist economists are asking, why have airlines and other businesses been given government subsidies so that they can figure out either how to operate or how to stay in business while they can't operate. But nobody asked the question, what kinds of financial subsidies should be given to schools and school districts so that they can figure out how to operate? So many office buildings are empty now. There might be space there for schools to have more classrooms in empty office buildings if there were funds to figure out how to convert, not permanently, but temporarily convert those buildings to classrooms, how to hire more substitute teachers for these children. But because caring for children is, first of all, schools have never wanted to see themselves as having a babysitting function. Schools want to see themselves as educators, and the babysitting function is either absent or irrelevant. Until today, when we see that people can't work if they don't have their children in school, and certainly their preschool children in school. But why are we not giving government subsidies to schools? Why are we not encouraging nationally conversations about how to get children to go to school? Why are we thinking that it's more important to worry about restaurants? I mean, I'm all for worrying about restaurants. I love restaurants. But really and truly, children and women who care for those children as unpaid work have had no subsidies to figure out how to keep children in school. So that's just an example of looking at a problem from a feminist lens and seeing very different issues than if you simply look at it from a business lens.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this was one of the questions that I had for you, was about, the disproportionate impact of COVID on women's lives, women's jobs. We know that women are more likely to have lost their jobs during this time and are more likely to have chosen to leave also because of the need to supervise homeschooling or take care of kids who are not in preschool or daycare. So what do we need to be doing to both raise awareness about this, but also to address this disproportionate impact of COVID?
Well, Stanford has kept its child care centers open. The capacity is reduced, but the child care centers are open, and parents can use them. This has required the university to put in a major subsidy because the child care centers cannot run in a financially viable way with so many less children. This is what we need to do nationally. We need to keep these centers open, and the government needs to subsidize them so that women can work. And I believe that we still, after all these years, don't value women's work in the same way. So the fact that, mothers now are not able to work doesn't seem to ring bells for us. The other thing that doesn't ring bells, because I think children are also devalued in this system, is the fact that these children are not getting the kind of education that they need. They're missing a whole year or more of their education, which is going to have highly negative ramifications. So, I don't know if the new administration will be more mindful of this. I hope so. But a lot of this has to do with money. And I don't know why money is not being allocated to figure out how to keep children in school.
Right. And then, of course, there's also the built-in assumptions, which are that it makes more sense for women somehow to be the ones responsible for stepping in when their kids aren't in school, right? And so some of that happens on a, on a family level in terms of what expectations are and negotiations within households. Sometimes it is caused by economic considerations, like women's jobs are often paid less, and so it makes more sense for the person who's bringing in less money to be the one to stay home. But there are all these different levels on which this happens, and sometimes it's just it's an unspoken, unexplored dynamic that is leading to a huge social impact.
Right. And often women ourselves, feel guilty if we aren't doing these things that we're supposed to do. And so, it's a vicious circle. It's not just that men are browbeating women. I think we women are browbeating ourselves. And, the circles keep going round and round. And it's hard to change social norms. Right. It's really hard. When I started doing this work, I never imagined that all these years later, I would be saying the same things over again. But it's really hard to change how we think about gender.
Yeah, and there was a place in your book which I thought was a very where you put this very strongly, where you talk about, you often look back on different decisions you made and kind of say, I can't believe I made that decision at that time. But when you write about how you and your husband didn't go on the job market together, but rather the assumption was that you would follow him wherever he got a job. And you say that, when I look back, I didn't even make the decision. It wasn't even a decision to make because it wasn't even a norm that I realized I had internalized.
Right.
And I think it is so hard to, it's hard enough to change the things that we already know we want to change. It's nearly impossible to change the things that we don't even recognize are things that we are influenced by or that need to change. And I thought about this again in your book where you talk about a committee that you chaired at Stanford on recruitment and retention of women faculty and all the different factors that went into why women were not retained or coming to Stanford. And it results in the Strober report, which has all these recommendations. And the range of the recommendations to me was really interesting. Some that were very sort of data oriented, like making it a requirement for deans to continue to monitor women's salaries on a regular basis. Some that were more about, putting into effect certain kinds of professional development and sexual harassment seminars and things like that. But you say that really one of the most important things was something that we would see as a much sort of softer kind of thing, which is creating a culture of support. And of course, those things are enormously important, and the culture shapes everything about what a person's work experience is like in a place. And yet, how do you do that, right? What are the ways that you change culture? What did you see as a result of that report and that recommendation? What are some of the ways that changed, do you think? I mean, if it did.
I don't know. By the way, the culture of support was not only for women, it was also for men.
For sure.
And one of the things that men, particularly men who are junior faculty, recognize more and more is that having more women on the faculty is beneficial for them, because it wasn't fun for men either to have the kind of culture that we had and still have to some degree. The book that Abby and I are writing is really designed to tell people, men and women, very much men and women, all of the decisions that they need to think about. So this question about should you go on the job market together, if you didn't think about it yourself, you might find it in our book. The question about moving, when should you move? What should be your strategy for moving? Whose job should be more important? I mean, one strategy for moving, which I think doesn't make much sense, is that people should take turns moving. This time it's your turn, next time it's your turn, the other person's turn. That may result in a situation where after 40 years, neither of you has done very well. So, just the old adage, well, let's just take turns, may not work. So all of these questions really deserve a lot of consideration and a lot of thought. And so Abby and I are working on a framework to help people make these decisions in a conscious way, so that you don't say 20 years later, gosh, why didn't I think of that?
Right. So much of it is about, I think, being able to articulate these challenges and then have a strategy for tackling them. I think, as we were saying, like the first step is really just even surfacing them as issues that are real issues and not, just things that are assumed in some way.
Right.
And I think it's also, as you're saying, it's like, this is one of the places where we see that feminism is good for everyone, that it, the changes that happen actually also free up men to make different kinds of decisions or have more flexibility or just work in a place that is a little bit more aware of people's full humanity, and certainly giving people the opportunity to explore these issues in a full way in their relationships also probably ultimately serves men better too.
Well, and I tell my male students, if your wife says, I need to stay at home, I don't want to go back to work after I've had this baby, I need to stay at home, your response shouldn't be, okay, honey, whatever you want, because that decision is going to affect you as much as it's going to affect her. And you both need to think about what this decision should be for the two of you.
Right. We have a great question from Virginia related to this, who asks, what do you consider the keys to transform the internalized social norms that affect women's daily lives?
I think talking about them is the key. Talking about them with your friends, talking about them with your significant other, talking about them with your family of origin, talking about them with the media, endlessly talking about them, because the more people hear different opinions about this, the more they say, oh, well, maybe I could think about it that way. And it bears repetition. So don't get bored talking about it. Keep going.
Right. Yes. Not only bears repetition, but probably takes many, many conversations to even get to a place where you can make any sense.
Takes many conversations.
Yeah. Well, these are, I think for all of these things, I think this is part of what is hard about social changes. It's not something that's ever done. You don't ever put these issues to bed, right? Or they morph into different kinds of things. So we may make progress on one thing, but I think one of the things I was thinking about as I was reading your book is that some things certainly have changed, but a lot of things haven't changed that much, right? I mean, I know that I wasn't in an economics department. I was in an American Studies department where I did my PhD, but there were still a lot of assumptions about the impact of children on academic careers for women, and a real discouragement, I would say, of graduate students having babies. We know that it's still hard for women to get tenure, and having a baby while you're on the tenure track, if you can even get a tenure track job now, which is a whole other question because of the casualization of labor, but that it has a much bigger impact on a woman's likelihood of getting tenure than it does on a man who may have had a baby during that time. So, I think there is a question as to how much progress we've actually made in all of this. I don't know if you looking back at your path in your career, do you feel hopeful about where things are headed on these issues? Do you feel
I do feel hopeful. I think there's been a lot of change. I think there are many, many more successful women in the academy now. Some of the women now who are successful are also women of color, and women whose sexual orientation is not straight. And so I think some of that is the new frontier, is making sure that that these changes come not just for white women, but for women of color, and for men and women who are not straight. But that said, there's still an enormous amount to be done. And it's still the case that for example, there was an article not long ago in the American, I can't remember if it was which economics journal it was, but somebody studied the publication rates of men and women who took parental leave, and discovered that some of the men who took parental leave actually increased their publications, because although they took parental leave, they weren't parenting, they were busy writing their articles. So, there are ways to foil the system, and it's going to take a while to get this straightened out.
Yeah, I saw a similar study just about this pandemic period that they're seeing now that in the conferences that are happening this year, there are fewer panels and papers that are being given by women, because all of those things were due in the months that people were stuck at home with their kids. And so many mothers were not writing conference proposals, but men were. And so now the impact is on, first of all, what those conferences look like, but also those conferences matter for people's tenure files and things like that, and for their research. And so, there are all these kinds of ways that it trickles out that we don't even see at the beginning, but we see later on.
I also think it's important to teach men and women who are interested in making social change that this is not something that you do by yourself. There was an article recently about a woman who was fired from a major corporation because she sent an email by herself and was punished for it. I want people to think that making social change, particularly in a work organization, is akin to climbing Everest. And you wouldn't climb Everest by yourself. You would prepare, you would go with others, you would have guides who knew what to do. If you want to make social change, think about it that way. Get allies, particularly get allies who are powerful people. Figure out exactly how your work organization system works before you try to change it. And certainly don't do it alone by sending an email to hundreds of people. That's not going to do anything except get you into trouble. And it's very sad that people still don't understand this, that social change requires a lot of thought, a lot of hard work, and a lot of allies.
Absolutely. I was thinking about your Mount Everest analogy. I also reminded me that in your book, you have some thoughts about different metaphors that people use for work-life balance. You say that you don't particularly like the juggling of balls as a metaphor, but you offer some alternatives. What are some of those?
Yeah, I really don't like the juggling metaphor. It makes me nervous right away. But the metaphor that I like, and that Abby and I are using in our book, is of a rocket going to some destination far away. And the rocket is not on target except when it's launched and when it lands. And in the interim, it has to constantly correct itself as it works its way up. And I think that's the same way with work and family. You have some goals, you have some kind of boundaries around your target path. And if you go beyond those boundaries, you want to make sure to come back, and you keep striving to get there. My daughter-in-law, Myra Strober, and her co-author, Sharon Mears, wrote a book called Getting to 50-50. And their point is that, you have to get there. We aren't there yet, and you don't arrive, but what life is getting there. And it's the same thing with work-family balance. You have to keep moving in the direction of work, which of course requires constant communication.
Right. So you might say that feminism actually is rocket science.
In that sense.
Yeah. You've talked a lot about your students and collaborations with students, and we have a great question about suggestions for how to mentor people well. You've obviously been a great mentor. So what are your tips for mentoring?
Well, the first tip is don't be overwhelmed. Because if you think about supply and demand, mentors are in short supply and the demand is so huge. And so one of the things you have to do is make decisions about whom you're going to mentor, how long you're going to mentor them, and what exactly this mentoring is going to consist of, because otherwise your entire life will be taken up by the mentoring and the rest of your life will disappear. So that's my first point. The second point is listen, do a lot of listening. I think those of us who have experienced all of this want to offer our advice first. But unless you listen first, you don't know what advice to give. And so I would say, don't overwhelm yourself with mentoring and do a lot of listening.
That sounds like terrific advice. I want to make sure we get back to your bat mitzvah. So you started off with your story about some of the early seeds of your feminist consciousness when you were denied a bat mitzvah as a kid, but then you did go on to have a bat mitzvah as an adult. So tell us a little bit about what that experience was like.
Well, I never knew that you could have an adult bat mitzvah, but my daughter postponed her bat mitzvah. And when we went to talk to the rabbi, he told her that you could have a bat mitzvah anytime, at least in the reform movement. And so I filed that away. I thought, oh, wow. And then a very dear friend of mine passed away. And I went to Friday night services after I came home from her funeral. And there was a flyer talking about adult bat mitzvahs. And I thought, this is it. I need to honor Helen's memory by having an adult bat mitzvah. And then I thought, oh no, why don't I wait till I retire? And then I said, nope, do it right now. So there were 9 of us, all of us working, all of us tired at the end of the day. And we went through this process and we had our bat mitzvah together. It was the most glorious thing. And I was so grateful that we had a rehearsal the Thursday night before the bat mitzvah, because at the rehearsal, when I held the yad in my hand and pointed to the letters and realized that I could read them, I just burst out crying. And I was glad that I did that at the rehearsal. And then on the Saturday morning service, I just read with so much joy. And I kept thinking about my grandfather and wondering what he would think about this, since he thought he was an Orthodox Jew. He thought that women shouldn't have bat mitzvahs. But somehow I thought that he would be proud. And I think I did it as much for him and for my mother as I did for myself.
That's amazing. And I'm sure your children were proud too.
And many of my grandchildren were there.
Yeah, well, that's another great way to be a role model, because, you know, it's great to be able to see people learning at every age and knowing that they can continue to learn and grow and hit different milestones at different times. It doesn't all have to happen on schedule exactly.
Right.
So we have a question about when your next book is coming out so that we can all be paying attention for it, looking for it eagerly.
I think spring of 22, but possibly summer of 22.
Okay, that's great. Well, we will work on raising these conversations even in the meantime without your instructions, but we'll look forward to having that book to help guide us along the way in these challenging times. And Abby has just shared. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Abby has just shared. Your co-author has just shared in the chat the link for a survey. They're doing a survey as part of the research for this book. the link for the survey is in the chat, so we encourage people to participate in that. That would be very helpful. And we'll also send that out in our follow-up email tomorrow. So if you don't want to deal with it now, we will include that link tomorrow.
Yes, because we want to collect stories for the book. I taught this class for almost 40 years, so I have a stock of stories. But we particularly want stories from younger people and from people who are experiencing this epidemic now and what's happening to your work family situations at the present time. So if you would share stories with us, we would be very grateful.
Wonderful. And we'll make sure that that goes out tomorrow too. So Myra, I want to thank you so much for being with us tonight, for sharing your work and your insights with us. And I just want to say a couple words about Chanukah, because tonight is the first night of Chanukah, and I want to be able to acknowledge that. But it occurred to me as I was thinking about Chanukah tonight that you are a very fitting guest for the first night, because in the Talmud, there's a debate about how to light Chanukah candles. Do you start with 1 and count up, which of course is what we do, spoiler alert, or start with 8 and count down? And the tradition goes by Hillel because of the idea, ma'alin b'kodesh, that we go up in sanctity. And so we start with 1 and we light 1 more each night. And, as I was thinking about your book and thinking about the power of pioneers, I was thinking about how pioneers start as one. They start alone and then they share their light and they make it possible for other people to be illuminated in that way. And Myra, I think you've done that in your work, and thank you so much for sharing your story, which then makes it possible for other people to build on that as well.
Thank you. That's lovely.
And for all of the rest of you, thank you for being here too, for sharing your comments and stories and questions in the chat. I hope that you will join us next Thursday evening for a conversation with the author Janice Kaplan on her book, The Genius of Women. In the meantime, I also hope you will check out the many, many resources we have in our digital archive at jwa.org, where you will find women's genius in so many forms. From scientists to artists to community builders to scholars, from people of all ages and backgrounds. If you're interested in mentoring and in pioneers, you might want to check out our Power Couples collection, which is a little collection we put together a few years ago that pairs pioneers in one field with younger up-and-coming people in those same fields. Perhaps you'd be interested in our new podcast series on creativity during the pandemic. We've put some of those links into the chat for you. Next week will be our last in this particular run of the Quarantine-ish book talks, but I assure you that we will be back in the new year after a little break with more of our gatherings and more conversations with writers and authors and others, as well as more online history courses. So in the meantime, wishing you all a Chanukah that is filled with light. Everyone should have a wonderful week, be well, be safe, and we will see you on Thursday. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.